September 3, 1939. 11:02 a.m. A torpedo moving at 44 knots tears through the hull of the SS Athenia. The explosion does not sound like thunder. It sounds like the ocean itself cracking open. Steel folds inward like paper. Fire erupts below the waterline. 1,400 passengers, women, children, a family from Toronto eating breakfast, a schoolteacher from Glasgow reading a novel, a retired dock worker watching the morning fog burn off the Atlantic. None of them heard the submarine coming. None of them saw the wake cutting through the gray water. The first thing they knew was fire. The second was the cold Atlantic rushing in. 117 people died that morning. The war was 14 hours old. And somewhere in the English countryside, a 54-year-old retired naval officer with a bad knee was growing roses. He had no idea that in less than a year, a desperate admiral would pick up a telephone and dial his number. He had no idea that an idea everyone in the British Admiralty would call insane, an idea dismissed as a relic, a joke, a suicide mission, would force the greatest submarine commander in history to rewrite his standing orders and waste resources he could never replace. His name was Gordon Campbell. He was not a general. He was not a strategist sitting in a war room. He was a gardener, a retired officer who read books and had strong opinions about the proper way to brew tea. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's coming next. Join us as we uncover more stories, events, and extraordinary moments from history, because the best ones are always the ones nobody talks about. And by the time his idea was finished, it had saved an estimated 12,000 lives, sunk 14 German submarines, and disrupted 200 patrol days per month of the most lethal naval force Britain had ever faced. But none of that mattered yet, because first, Britain had to nearly lose everything. Here is what losing looked like. Between the outbreak of war and May 1943, German U-boats sank over 3,500 Allied merchant ships in the Atlantic Ocean. Let that number sit for a moment. 3,500 vessels. Food, medicine, fuel, steel, ammunition, rubber. Everything an island nation needed to feed its people, run its factories, and fight a war sent to the seafloor by wolf packs of submarines operating with a precision and coordination the Royal Navy had never faced and was completely unprepared to counter. In 1940 alone, the tonnage lost exceeded 4 million tons. Britain had imported 68 million tons of goods per year before the war. By 1941, that number had collapsed to under 30 million. The country was being strangled in slow motion. Rationing tightened every month. Factories ran short of raw materials. Children in English cities went to bed hungry, and the men responsible for keeping the Atlantic open sat in a reinforced bunker beneath Derby House in Liverpool, staring at charts covered in black crosses that marked the graves of ships running out of ideas. Winston Churchill, the man who stood in London while the Luftwaffe dropped bombs on his city night after night, who faced the fall of France, the threatened invasion, the disasters at Dunkirk and Singapore and North Africa, said later that the U-boat campaign was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war. Not the bombs, not the tanks massing on the French coast, the submarines. Because the submarines were winning. Karl Dönitz understood his advantage with crystalline clarity. He was the admiral commanding Germany's submarine fleet, and he operated his wolf packs from Lorient on the coast of occupied France with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had been right about everything for years. His commanders were young, aggressive, technically superb. He gave them one instruction above everything else: sink tonnage. Do not pursue glory. Do not waste time on individual heroics. Sink tonnage and let the mathematics do the rest. The mathematics were doing the rest. Every week more black crosses on the chart at Derby House. Every week more telegrams to families in Liverpool and Bristol and Glasgow and Belfast. The Atlantic was enormous. The convoy routes stretched thousands of miles. Escort vessels were desperately short. Land-based aircraft could only reach so far, leaving a vast gap in the mid-Atlantic, where U-boats hunted with near total impunity. Radar was primitive. Sonar had severe limitations. Intelligence from code breaking was intermittent and often arrived too late to act on. The U-boats held every advantage, and Dönitz knew it. Every solution the Royal Navy tried failed. Convoys helped, but couldn't cover the entire ocean. Escort ships were too few. Aircraft couldn't reach the killing grounds. Depth charges required a submarine you could already locate. Month after month, the black crosses multiplied. Month after month, the strangulation tightened. But there was one vulnerability in the German submarine that almost nobody was talking about. One flaw so fundamental it had existed since the very first U-boat slid into the water. And Gordon Campbell had understood that flaw for 20 years. Campbell was not a man who looked like someone who would change the course of a naval war. He was quiet, methodical, the kind of officer who spoke in short sentences and expected results rather than applause. Born in 1886, he had entered the Royal Navy as a young man and spent the years before the First World War as a career officer, with what his superiors charitably described as a serviceable record. Not brilliant, not destined for flag rank, competent, dependable, and largely overlooked. Then the First War came, and everything changed. Between 1915 and 1918, Campbell commanded Q-ships, the Royal Navy's original deception vessels in the war against the German submarine fleet of that era. He had personally lured submarines to the surface, watched them approach through a concealed observation slit with their deck guns ready, and their crews confident they were about to kill a helpless merchant ship. And then he had dropped the disguise, opened fire at point-blank range, and watched submarines die. He had been torpedoed. He had been sunk. He had watched men under his command drown in freezing water, while he maintained the deception until the absolute last second, because breaking character one moment too early meant failure, and failure meant death. He had done it 3 confirmed times. He survived all 3. For that, the king gave him the Victoria Cross. After the war, Campbell retired. He grew roses. He read books. He developed opinions about the proper way to brew tea that his family found unreasonable. His knee, damaged in one of the sinkings, gave him trouble every winter. He was, by all outward appearances, finished a relic of the last war, living quietly in the English countryside, while the world rebuilt itself around him. Then September 1939 arrived. Then the black crosses started appearing. Then, in the winter of 1940, a junior admiral at the Admiralty, who had done his research, who had read the after-action reports from the First War and understood what they meant, picked up a telephone and dialed a number in the English countryside. Campbell later said he accepted the commission before the admiral finished the sentence. He was 54 years old, with a bad knee and no active command experience in 20 years. He did not hesitate for a single second. The idea he brought with him was deceptively simple and almost supernaturally counterintuitive. Every U-boat commander in the German Navy knew intellectually that Q-ships existed. They had been briefed. The concept was in the tactical manuals. The First War had produced confirmed cases of U-boats lured to their deaths by disguised vessels, and Dönitz's commanders were trained to watch for deception. This was precisely the argument senior officers at the Admiralty used when Campbell first presented his proposal. The Germans know about Q-ships. The element of surprise is gone. The program failed in the second half of the last war. What makes you think it will work now? Campbell's answer was characteristically blunt and entirely correct. Knowledge and vigilance are not the same thing. Yes, every U-boat commander had been told Q-ships existed. Yes, they were trained to watch for them. But they had also spent the first year of the Atlantic campaign sinking merchant ships almost at will. Easy kills, helpless targets, crews abandoning in panic, ship after ship going down without meaningful resistance. When you spend 12 months as an apex predator, When every patrol ends with your torpedo count depleted and your kill log full, when the Royal Navy's best efforts cannot stop you from operating with near total freedom across 40 million square miles of ocean, you do not spend every surface engagement trembling with suspicion. You start to believe in your own invincibility, and invincibility makes you sloppy. That sloppiness was the gap Campbell intended to put his guns into. He also understood something more specific and more exploitable than general overconfidence. A Type 7 U-boat, the workhorse of Donitz's fleet, carried only 14 torpedoes. 14. Each one represented weeks of industrial production at the German dockyards. Each one was irreplaceable at sea. Donitz's standing orders were explicit: if a target can be destroyed by surface gunfire, use surface gunfire. Save the torpedoes for convoys. Save them for the big kills, the tankers, the troop transports, the heavily loaded freighters. Do not waste a torpedo on a lone, slow, apparently damaged merchant vessel when your 88mm deck gun can do the job for free. This order was not a weakness Dönitz had overlooked. It was rational, mathematically sound, and tactically correct. Against any normal merchant ship, surfacing and shelling was faster, cheaper, and just as effective as a torpedo attack. Against a Q ship, it was the last mistake the commander would ever make. The conversion of Campbell's first vessels began in Liverpool in the autumn of 1940 under absolute secrecy. The ships selected were deliberately aggressively ordinary coastal freighters, battered steamers, vessels between 2,000 and 6,000 tons that would not merit a second glance from any observer above or below the surface. Dockyard workers who performed the conversions were sworn to silence. The work happened behind screened berths away from the main shipbuilding areas, and every record was classified at the highest possible level. The engineering was extraordinary. The main armament, typically a pair of 4-inch QF Mark V naval guns, was concealed behind hinged wooden panels, machined to match the surrounding superstructure with such precision that even a close inspection from the waterside would reveal nothing unusual. These panels were mounted on spring-loaded mechanisms, capable of dropping flat in under 2 seconds. Behind them, gun crews waited in cramped, lightless compartments, sometimes for hours, sometimes for entire days, with their weapons loaded and their hands on the firing lanyards. Additional weapons included 20mm automatic cannons hidden inside false ventilator housings, depth charge racks beneath removable deck plating, and in some configurations, torpedo tubes built into structures that looked exactly like lifeboat davits. Every single detail was designed to withstand scrutiny through a periscope at ranges as close as 500 yards. But the weapons were only half the deception. The other half was theater. Campbell had spent years thinking about how U-boat commanders actually made decisions during surface engagements. He had designed a performance intended to lock every one of their mental processes onto a single conclusion. This ship is helpless. This crew is panicking. This is an easy kill. He called it the panic party. When a U-boat surfaced and ordered the ship to stop, a selected group of crew members would immediately begin an elaborate, carefully rehearsed performance of abandoning ship. They would lower lifeboats with exaggerated clumsiness. They would stumble across the deck carrying personal belongings. One man would deliberately fall into the water. Another would wave frantically at the submarine, as though begging for mercy. The performance had to be perfect. Convincing enough to hold the U-boat captain's attention on the surface, close enough to the ship, long enough for the gunnery officer watching through a concealed slit to calculate range and bearing and angle and weight. Wait until missing was nearly impossible. Wait until the gap between the submarine and the ship was so small that a trained naval gun crew firing at point-blank range simply could not fail. Then the order came. The panels fell. The guns spoke. Crews were recruited entirely from volunteers. Every man who signed on understood what they were being asked to do. They were being asked to sail alone without escort into the shipping lanes where U-boat activity was highest. They were being asked to be the bait. They knew that if a U-boat commander chose to fire a torpedo, Instead of surfacing, there would be no deception, no trick, no second chance. Just the detonation and the cold Atlantic rushing in. They went anyway. All of them. Without hesitation. Campbell sent his first vessels out in early 1941. The early patrols were exercises in patience and nerve that pushed men to the absolute edge of psychological endurance. Days would pass. Nothing. The ship would move through gray, featureless ocean, maintaining the speed and course of a genuine merchant vessel, broadcasting on standard commercial frequencies, behaving in every detectable way, exactly like what she appeared to be. The hidden crew lived in conditions that were cramped, dark, and stifling. They could not go on deck. They could not smoke. They could not make noise. They existed in a state of permanent readiness that wore on the nerves like sandpaper on skin day after day in the dark, waiting for a sound that meant either the beginning of a fight or the end of everything. And then, on a morning in August 1941, 400 miles west of Ireland, the sound came. A U-boat surfaced 3,000 yards off the port quarter. She was a Type 7C, one of Dönitz's frontline boats, and her captain was following standard procedure for engaging a lone merchant target. He ordered the freighter to stop. The panic party deployed. 8 men scrambled into a lifeboat with urgency that looked completely genuine. The U-boat began to close. At 1,500 yards, the gunnery officer could see the submarine's crew manning their deck gun. At 1,000, he could see the captain on the conning tower watching through binoculars. At 700 yards, he gave the order. The panels crashed down. 4 guns fired simultaneously. The first salvo struck the conning tower and forward hull. The second hit the waterline. The submarine never had time to dive. She sank in under 4 minutes. There were no survivors. 1 Q ship, 1 patrol, 1 surfaced U-boat that approached a helpless-looking merchant ship and discovered at 700 yards that it was the last thing it would ever discover. Campbell had proven his concept. The idea they called insane had just sent a German submarine to the bottom of the North Atlantic in less time than it takes to drink a cup of tea. But this single kill was about to trigger something he had not entirely anticipated. Because Dönitz was not the kind of man who lost a submarine and moved on. He was the kind of man who studied his losses, identified the pattern, and adapted with a ruthlessness the Royal Navy had severely underestimated. In Part 2, we will see the adaptation that changed everything, how Dönitz struck back, how the Q-ship crews faced their darkest hours, and how one meeting in a reinforced bunker beneath the streets of Liverpool gave Campbell 90 days to prove that 3 disguised freighters could change the mathematics of the most devastating naval campaign in human history. The hunters were about to become the hunted. And the question was no longer whether the Q-ships could sink submarines. The question was whether any of the men inside them would survive long enough to find out. Gordon Campbell had done the impossible. 1 disguised freighter, 1 German U-boat that surfaced expecting an easy kill. 4 minutes. No survivors. The Q-ship concept worked, but sinking 1 submarine in the North Atlantic was not going to win the Battle of the Atlantic. And the man standing between Campbell and everything he needed was not Karl Dönitz. It was a British admiral sitting in a reinforced bunker beneath the streets of Liverpool. In the 3 months following that first confirmed kill, 11 more merchant ships went to the bottom of the Atlantic every single week. 11 ships. Every week. And the admiral responsible for stopping those losses was about to tell Campbell that his floating deception program was a luxury Britain could no longer afford. This is where the story gets complicated. And this is where it gets brutal. Vice Admiral Percy Noble was not a stupid man. He was not an arrogant man. He was a man who was losing a war, and he knew exactly how badly he was losing it. As Commander-in-Chief, Western Approaches Noble sat at the center of the most complex logistical and tactical problem in British naval history. His escort forces were stretched so thin that some convoys crossed the Atlantic protected by 2 warships for 40 merchant ships. 2 warships, 40 ships. The mathematics of that ratio were enough to make a man lose sleep every night, which is precisely what Noble was doing. When Campbell arrived at Derby House in September 1941, carrying his after-action report from the first confirmed Q-ship kill, he expected recognition. What he received was something entirely different. Noble sat across the table with two senior staff captains and laid out the situation with the bluntness of a man who had no patience for anything that did not directly address the body count on his charts. He looked at Campbell for a long moment. Then he spoke. "Commander, you sank one submarine. I am grateful. But I lost 11 merchant ships this week alone. 11. I need escort vessels. I need corvettes, destroyers, and long-range aircraft. What I do not need is merchant hulls being converted into weapons that may or may not encounter a target in 6 months of patrol." Campbell sat very still. He had heard this argument before. He had heard a version of it in the First War in different rooms with different admirals, wearing the same expression of exhausted pragmatism. He knew Noble was not wrong. Every hull converted into a Q-ship was a hull removed from convoy duty. Every trained sailor assigned to a Q-ship crew was a sailor who could have manned an escort. The mathematics of scarcity were working against him, and Noble understood those mathematics better than almost anyone alive. "With respect, sir," Campbell said, "I am not asking you to win the Battle of the Atlantic with Q-ships. I am asking you to make every U-boat commander in the ocean wonder whether the next ship he sees is going to shoot back. Doubt is not measurable in tonnage reports, but it costs torpedoes. And torpedoes are something Dönitz cannot replace at sea." Noble studied him for a moment. Then he opened a folder on the table and slid it across. It contained casualty figures, merchant sailors lost in the previous quarter. Campbell looked at the number. He did not speak. Noble let the silence sit for 10 full seconds. 3 vessels, Noble said. 90 days. If those 3 ships demonstrate a measurable shift in U-boat behavior in their assigned patrol areas, the program continues. If they cannot, the hulls go back to convoy service, and this program is officially finished. Do you understand what I am offering you, Commander? Campbell understood perfectly. 3 ships, 90 days, 41 million square miles of ocean. He said yes before Noble finished the sentence. But as Campbell walked out of Derby House into the gray Liverpool afternoon, he understood something Noble did not yet know. The problem with 3 ships and 90 days was not resources. The problem was doctrine. The original Q-ship approach sail into dangerous waters maintained the deception. Weight was fundamentally passive. 3 ships and 90 days was not enough time for patience. He needed a completely different tactical framework. And he needed it immediately. He found it in the most unexpected place imaginable. Frederick John Walker was 31 years old, and technically should not have been anywhere near a classified program operating at Campbell's level of seniority. He held the rank of lieutenant commander, which in the rigid hierarchy of the Royal Navy placed him several floors below the kind of officer normally consulted about strategic deception programs. But Walker had spent 2 years doing something very few officers had done with the same systematic intensity. He had been studying how Dönitz thought. Not how U-boats operated technically. How their commanders made decisions. Where the hesitation points were. What information a captain needed before choosing to surface. What degree of confidence made him careless. Walker had filled notebooks with behavioral analysis drawn from interrogation transcripts, patrol reports, and intelligence intercepts. When Campbell met him through a mutual contact in Liverpool and showed him the Q-ship concept, Walker did not see a gimmick. He saw a psychological weapon being aimed in entirely the wrong direction. "You are not trying to sink submarines," Walker told Campbell at their first meeting, leaning over a chart table covered in annotated patrol routes. "You are trying to break their confidence. A submarine you sink completes 1 fewer patrol. A submarine whose captain no longer trusts what he sees on the surface changes his behavior on every patrol for the rest of the war. That behavioral change is worth more than any depth charge ever dropped in the Atlantic." Walker's revision was built on a single insight. The original panic party, the performance of terrified civilians abandoning a dying ship, had been designed for maximum visual credibility. But Dönitz's commanders had been briefed on the panic party. An abandonment that was too clean, too immediate, too coordinated might actually register as suspicious rather than genuine. A trained crew executing a rehearsed drill and a genuinely terrified civilian crew falling apart under pressure did not look identical through a periscope at 800 yards. Walker had studied enough interrogation transcripts to know the difference, and he built that difference directly into the new doctrine. The revised performance introduced deliberate imperfection. The panic party would hesitate before deploying. Some men would appear to argue about whether to abandon. Someone would go back below for something forgotten. A lifeboat davit would jam. A man would drop something heavy over the side. Another would climb halfway down a rope ladder, appear to lose his grip and fall into the water. The entire production was redesigned to look not like trained men executing a drill, but like terrified civilians disintegrating under the weight of their own fear. The difference was subtle. It was also critical. If the original panic party was theater, Walker's revision was cinema. And the 3 ships Noble had allocated were about to become the most dangerous stages in the Atlantic. November 23, 1941. 200 miles southwest of Iceland. 6-12 hours. The light was just coming up over a gray heaving sea when the lookout on HMS Dodington spotted the contact. A Type 7 U-boat running on the surface to recharge her batteries after a night spent submerged, moving northeast at 7 knots, heading directly toward the Q-ship's position. The U-boat's bridge watch spotted the Dodington 3 minutes later. The German captain ran the calculation that Dönitz's standing orders required. Lone merchant vessel. No escort. Apparent speed under 9 knots. Deck gun engagement. Standard procedure. He ordered his boat to close and fired a warning shot across the Dodington's bow at 2,000 yards. Lieutenant Commander James Henderson, commanding the Q-ship, ordered engines stopped and triggered Walker's revised panic party. What the German captain saw through his binoculars was not the clean, immediate evacuation his briefings had described as the Q-ship's signature behavior. What he saw was chaos. Men appeared on deck shouting at each other. A lifeboat swung out and jammed crookedly in its davits. A man dropped something heavy over the side. It splashed into the water audibly. 2 crew members appeared to be physically fighting over a single life jacket. Another man climbed halfway down a rope ladder on the port side, appeared to lose his grip, and fell into the Atlantic with a splash visible clearly from the conning tower at 1,500 yards. The German captain watched for 3 full minutes. He watched because what he saw was precisely what he expected genuine panic to look like. Not rehearsed, not coordinated. Messy, human, and real. He was satisfied. He closed the distance. At 800 yards. At 700. At 600, his deck gun crew loaded a second round, preparing to finish the job efficiently. At 550 yards, the captain lowered his binoculars and turned to give an order to his crew. Henderson gave his own order first. Panels down in 1.8 seconds. 4 guns fired simultaneously. The first salvo hit the U-boat amidships, punching through the pressure hull at a range where a trained naval gun crew simply could not miss. The second salvo struck the conning tower. A third hit the stern near the aft torpedo tubes. The submarine shuddered, rolled, began taking water through holes the diameter of dinner plates. She sank in 2 minutes and 40 seconds. 7 German sailors were pulled from the water. The captain was not among them. The intelligence extracted from those 7 survivors at Trent Park was more valuable than the submarine itself. The captured sailors reported that their captain had discussed Q-ships with his officers before the engagement and dismissed the threat explicitly. His exact words, preserved in the interrogation transcript, were that Q-ships were a relic of the previous war, and no experienced commander would fall for such an obvious deception. He had been experienced. He had been trained. He had known Q-ships existed, and he had watched 8 men convincingly fall apart on the deck of what appeared to be a dying merchant ship, and decided that what he was seeing was exactly what it looked like. Walker's revision had worked not despite the German briefings, but because of them. The captain had been watching for the old version. He had never considered that the performance might be deliberately imperfect. But the debriefings revealed something else. Something that justified the entire 90-day gamble in a single piece of intelligence. The captured sailors reported that at least 2 other U-boat commanders in their flotilla had recently expressed reluctance to conduct surface engagements against lone merchants. Not because they had encountered Q-ships, because they had heard about Q-ships and could no longer be entirely certain that a vessel presenting as helpless actually was. The doubt was already spreading beyond the ships that had fired a single shot. Campbell took these results back to Noble. The 90-day data showed that in patrol areas where Q-ships operated, the ratio of surface gun engagements to torpedo attacks against lone merchants shifted measurably. Before Q-ship operations, approximately 60% of attacks on lone merchants were conducted on the surface with deck guns. After 3 months, that number had dropped to under 35%. The U-boats were spending more torpedoes. They were engaging from greater range. They were being less efficient. And in Donitz's war of mathematical attrition, inefficiency was exactly what Britain needed. Noble authorized the expansion. 6 additional vessels. Operational control to Campbell. Tactical doctrine to Walker. For the first time since the program's revival, the Q-ship concept had genuine institutional support. Recruitment went out to volunteers across the fleet, men who understood they were being asked to sail alone into the worst waters in the world and perform convincingly as bait. There was not a single shortage of volunteers. Not one. But expansion created something that had not existed before. Scale. 9 ships operating across thousands of miles of ocean, multiple engagements, multiple survivors on both sides, and multiple sets of German sailors eventually sitting across from intelligence officers at Trent Park, describing in progressively more accurate detail what a Q-ship looked like, how it behaved, and where it had last been operating. The secret was getting harder to keep. And in Berlin, in the operations rooms of the Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote, Donitz's intelligence staff were beginning to assemble the pieces. The loss reports showed a pattern that did not correspond to any known convoy escort activity. Submarines engaging lone merchants were disappearing without distress signals, without the signatures of a conventional depth charge attack. Simply gone. Someone drew a circle around the clusters on a chart and wrote 2 words in the margin of the intelligence summary. Sonderfahrzeuge aktiv. Special ships active. Donitz read that report on January 14, 1942. He understood immediately what it meant, and within 72 hours, he had issued a new standing order to every U-boat commander in the Atlantic, an order that would transform Q-ship patrols from dangerous into nearly suicidal, drop the crew survival rate to 11% in the space of 6 weeks, and begin the bloodiest chapter of a program that the men who served in it could not speak about for 30 years. The hunters had become the hunted. And in Part 3, we will see exactly what happens when the most lethal submarine fleet in history stops playing by the rules and decides it wants blood. Gordon Campbell had started with 1 rusted freighter and an idea every admiral called insane. By the end of Part 2, that idea had become 9 operational vessels, a measurable shift in U-boat behavior, and a classified program that was quietly rewriting the mathematics of the Atlantic War. The ratio of surface gun attacks against lone merchants had dropped from 60% to under 35%. Donitz was spending torpedoes he could not afford. And then on January 14, 1942, he read 2 words written in a margin. Special ships active. Within 72 hours he issued new orders, and the survival rate for Q-ship crews hit by torpedoes fell to 11% in 6 weeks. This was no longer a test. This was a war inside a war, and it was about to get savage. Dönitz did not panic. That was what made him genuinely dangerous. He studied the loss reports with the methodical patience of a man who had built his entire career on understanding patterns. Submarines engaging lone merchants were disappearing without distress signals, without the acoustic signatures of a conventional escort attack. Simply gone. No wreckage consistent with depth charges. No radio contact cut by surface engagement. Just silence where a submarine used to be. He called his senior staff together at Lorient on January 16th. The meeting lasted 4 hours. By the end of it, Dönitz had reached a conclusion that cost him something he could not easily afford: mathematical efficiency. His new standing order was precise and devastating. Effective immediately, all surface engagements against lone merchant vessels were to be conducted with extreme caution. Commanders were authorized to expend torpedoes against targets that would previously have been considered too low value to warrant them. Any vessel exhibiting unusual behavior of any kind was to be treated as hostile and engaged from depth, without surfacing, without warning, and without hesitation. Read that order again carefully. Dönitz was now telling his commanders to waste torpedoes, to fire from depth at lone merchants that his entire strategic doctrine had designated as deck gun targets. Campbell's psychological weapon had worked so completely that Dönitz was voluntarily degrading his own operational efficiency to neutralize it. That was the strategic victory. But the immediate tactical consequence for Q-ship crews was catastrophic. A U-boat firing a torpedo from depth at 1,500 yards against a merchant-sized vessel gave that vessel zero opportunity to use its concealed weapons. The panels stayed closed, the guns stayed silent. The torpedo hit, and the ship either survived or it did not. In March 1942, HMS Dodington was patrolling 200 miles west of the Bay of Biscay, when 2 torpedoes struck without warning from a submerged U-boat at 1,400 yards. The first hit the engine room, the second hit the forward hold. Dodington broke apart in under 90 seconds. 29 of her 38 crew died. The U-boat never surfaced. 3 weeks later, a sister ship in the mid-Atlantic suffered an identical fate. 14 survivors from 41 crew. No surface engagement. No opportunity to fight back. Just the detonation and the Atlantic coming in. Campbell received both casualty reports at his Liverpool headquarters. For the first time since the program began, he sat alone in his office for a very long time without speaking. The crisis deepened in April when questions were raised in Parliament. A backbench MP with naval connections asked a pointed question about special service vessels and their casualty rates during a committee session. The First Lord's response was evasive enough to answer nothing while confirming everything that mattered. Within the Admiralty, voices that had always been skeptical grew louder and more organized. The hulls were needed for convoy escort. The trained crews were needed on destroyers. The program had demonstrated its concept. Was it not time to accept that the Q-ships had served their purpose and close the program before losses became indefensible? Campbell fought simultaneously on 3 fronts: against Dönitz's adaptation, against institutional resistance that had never fully believed in what he was doing, and against his own doubts, which he confided to Walker during a meeting in Liverpool that Walker later described as the lowest point of the entire campaign. He wrote in his personal log during this period a single sentence that Walker never forgot: "We are asking volunteers to absorb a cost we cannot protect them from." But Walker's response was the same thing he always said when the tactical situation became untenable: stop reacting. Start creating. Walker had been analyzing interrogation transcripts from every captured U-boat crew since the program began. He had identified a consistent error in the German intelligence briefings. Dönitz's commanders had been told that Q-ships were purely defensive vessels that would only reveal their weapons when directly attacked. The possibility that a Q-ship might actively approach a U-boat, might deliberately close the distance instead of waiting to be approached, had not appeared in any German briefing document Walker could find. The Germans had built their countermeasures around a static model. Walker proposed making the model dynamic. Stop waiting for submarines to come to you. Go to them. May 9, 1942, North Atlantic, 460 miles southwest of Iceland, 0538 hours. The light was gray and flat across a sea running in long, slow swells. Lieutenant Commander Arthur Henderson's lookouts spotted the contacts simultaneously. Not one conning tower. 2. Type 9 ocean-going boats, larger, more heavily armed than anything the Q-ship program had previously engaged. Running northeast on the surface, approximately 1 mile apart, at cruising speed. Henderson had 30 seconds to make a decision. He did not run. He did not alter course to avoid detection. He turned his ship directly toward the nearest U-boat and increased speed. The move was counterintuitive. It was also exactly right. A merchant ship running toward a submarine looks like a ship whose lookouts are focused in the wrong direction. A ship blundering into danger rather than away from it. The nearest U-boat commander saw precisely what Henderson intended him to see. An easy target stumbling into his path. He surfaced. He manned his deck gun. He closed to engage. The second U-boat, seeing her companion begin a surface action altered course to observe from approximately 2,000 yards to the east. Watching, not yet committed. Henderson triggered Walker's revised panic party. His version was even more elaborate than the original. One man pretended to faint on the open deck. 2 others appeared to fight over a jammed lifeboat davit. A 4th climbed halfway down a rope ladder on the port side, appeared to lose his grip, and fell into the water with a splash, visible clearly from the conning tower. At 900 yards, the U-boat closed. 800, 700. At 600 yards, her deck gun crew loaded a second round. At 550 yards, her captain lowered his binoculars and turned to give an order. Henderson gave his own order first. Ash panels down, 1.6 seconds, 4 guns, simultaneous. The first salvo hit the conning tower and the forward deck gun position. Men fell. The second salvo punched through the pressure hull amidships at a range where accuracy was not skill, but physics. The submarine lurched violently to port. Water erupted along her flanks. She was finished, and everyone on both vessels knew it. Henderson was already swinging his guns east before the first U-boat finished dying. The second U-boat had begun an emergency dive the instant the panels dropped. Her captain had watched his companion's conning tower take the first salvo and understood with the clarity of a man watching his own death that every second on the surface was a second he could not afford. Henderson's gun crews put 6 rounds into the water around the diving submarine in 40 seconds. At least 2 shells struck the conning tower as it disappeared beneath the surface. Depth charges from the Q-ship's concealed racks detonated at 50 feet, then again at 100. The sea around the diving point boiled white. Then went still. The first U-boat sank in 3 minutes. The second surfaced 12 minutes later. Her conning tower was shattered. Oil poured from her hull in long dark ribbons spreading across the surface. Her crew came out of every hatch with their hands raised. Henderson took 31 German prisoners that morning. 2 U-boats engaged. 2 U-boats destroyed. 1 crew lost entirely. 1 crew captured almost intact. The intelligence from those 31 prisoners was extraordinary. The captured officers confirmed precisely what Walker had suspected. Their briefings had described Q-ships as defensive reactive vessels. The concept of active approach, a Q-ship deliberately closing distance with a surfaced submarine, had never been briefed. Henderson had walked directly through the gap. Donitz's war diary entry for May 12th recorded the loss in terms that revealed genuine operational frustration. 2 boats to a single deception vessel, not merely a tactical defeat. An intelligence failure requiring immediate review. He reassigned patrol areas to reduce surface transit exposure. He authorized commanders to expend torpedoes against any lone vessel in identified Q-ship operational areas, regardless of apparent value. And he did something that had been mathematically unthinkable since the first day of the campaign. He accepted a sustained reduction in torpedo efficiency as the permanent cost of operating in waters where Q-ships might be present. The aggregate numbers told the story in language no skeptical admiral at the Admiralty could dismiss. Before the Q-ship program, U-boats in the Atlantic expended an average of 6.2 torpedoes per patrol against lone merchants and stragglers. By June 1942, that number had risen to 9.7. Each additional torpedo fired at a lone target was a torpedo unavailable for convoy attacks. Convoy losses, while still devastating, showed a measurable decline in areas where Q-ship operations overlapped with convoy routes. Before Q-ship operations, 60% of attacks on lone merchants used surface deck guns. By mid-1942, that number had fallen to under 28%. Dönitz was spending more achieving less and operating with a level of caution that his entire strategic doctrine had been built to avoid. The behavioral disruption was spreading beyond the specific patrol areas where Q-ships operated. U-boat commanders who had never encountered a Q-ship were altering their surface engagement procedures because the mere possibility of a disguised vessel had been absorbed into their tactical thinking. Campbell had described this effect to Noble as doubt. Noble had dismissed it as unmeasurable. By the summer of 1942, it was appearing in German patrol logs, in commanders' personal diaries, in the testimony of captured officers who had changed their habits in waters where no Q-ship had ever sailed. Campbell was promoted. Walker received a commendation that could not be publicly explained in any detail that made sense. Henderson was awarded the Distinguished Service Order with a citation so carefully vague it could have applied to almost any naval action in the Atlantic. The men who crewed the Q-ships received no public acknowledgement at all. Their families were told they served on merchant vessels. Their neighbors believed them to be ordinary sailors doing ordinary war work. The secret held completely. But across the Atlantic, across the English Channel, something was happening that nobody in the Royal Navy yet knew about. Dönitz had spent 2 years trying to defeat Campbell's deception. He had studied the loss reports. He had revised his standing orders. He had reassigned patrol areas and authorized torpedo expenditure he could not afford. And somewhere in that process, somewhere between the frustration and the adaptation, he had arrived at a conclusion that represented the highest possible validation of everything Campbell had built. He had decided that he wanted one for himself. A proposal was taking shape in February 1943. German merchant vessels converted into armed decoys, sailing among Allied convoys, transmitting false intelligence, attacking escort vessels from within the formation itself. Campbell's concept turned inside out, and the fact that it existed at all revealed something no operational report could have communicated as clearly. The man who had spent 2 years trying to kill the Q-ship program had been so impressed by what it did that he wanted to copy it. But Campbell never knew about that proposal, because March 1943 was coming, and with it, a classified memorandum from the First Sea Lord's office that would end the program with the quiet finality of a door closing in an empty room. The men who had sailed alone into the worst ocean in the world were about to be told their services were no longer required. That is the final chapter, and almost no one knows how it ends. Gordon Campbell had walked into the Admiralty in 1940 with a Victoria Cross from the last war, a bad knee, and an idea that senior officers described as a relic. He converted rusted freighters into floating traps, hid naval guns behind false walls, sent volunteers alone into the deadliest ocean on Earth, and forced Karl Dönitz to rewrite the operational doctrine of the most dangerous submarine fleet in history. The Q-ship program had proven its concept earned institutional support, expanded to 9 vessels, and contributed to saving an estimated 12,000 merchant sailor lives through disruption alone. But the cliffhanger at the end of Part 3 was not about submarines or tactics or mathematics. It was about the man who built all of it. What happened to Gordon Campbell when the Admiralty decided his program was finished? The answer contains a truth that the institution buried so thoroughly it took nearly 60 years to fully surface. Because in secret warfare, success does not always protect the people who create it. Sometimes, success is the very thing that destroys them. The memorandum arrived on March 28, 1943. Stamped with the kind of bureaucratic language that conceals enormous consequences inside small words. The Q-ship program was to be suspended pending strategic review. Vessels currently operational were to be returned to conventional merchant service. Crews were to be reassigned. Records were to be sealed at the highest classification level. Campbell read it twice in his Liverpool office and sat very still for a long time. The logic behind the decision was, from the Admiralty's perspective, defensible. New escort carriers were arriving. Long-range Liberator aircraft were closing the mid-Atlantic air gap. Ultra-intelligence from Bletchley Park was providing reliable U-boat position data. Centimetric radar was transforming night surface detection. The technological balance was shifting dramatically, and the resources allocated to Q-ships, the hulls, the trained crews, the dockyard conversion time were needed for these faster, more certain tools. The program had served its purpose. Campbell argued against the suspension with every instrument available to him. He wrote memoranda, laying out data, showing that the psychological impact of Q-ships continued to alter U-boat behavior, even in areas where no Q-ships were actually operating. Donitz's commanders had internalized the threat so completely that the mere possibility of a Q-ship changed their calculations. Remove the Q-ships entirely, Campbell argued, and eventually, that doubt would fade. The Admiralty listened carefully and proceeded with the suspension anyway. The last operational Q-ship returned to port in May 1943. The program was over. Campbell was offered a desk position reviewing convoy procedures. He accepted because there was nothing else to accept. He served the remainder of the war in an office overlooking the Thames processing paperwork for a naval establishment that had already moved beyond everything he had built. He retired for the second and final time in 1945, aged 59, holding a Victoria Cross from the First War and a Distinguished Service Order from the Second. He grew roses again. He read books. His knee continued to give him trouble in winter. The men who had served under him were forbidden by the Official Secrets Act from telling anyone what they had done. Their families were told they had served on merchant vessels. Their neighbors believed them to be ordinary sailors doing ordinary war work. Campbell himself never spoke publicly about the Second War Program in any meaningful detail. He died in 1953. His obituary in the Times mentioned his first war service and his Victoria Cross. It did not mention the Q-ship program. It did not mention the Second War Program at all. A man who had changed the mathematics of the Battle of the Atlantic died as quietly as a retired gardener, and the institution he had served twice buried his second contribution as thoroughly as if it had never existed. Walker's fate carried its own particular weight. The tactical genius who had transformed Q-ship doctrine from passive deception into active psychological warfare went on to become the most successful anti-submarine commander in the Royal Navy. He took the principles developed with Campbell, the deep understanding of U-boat psychology, the willingness to engineer encounters rather than wait for them, the exploitation of behavioral patterns under pressure, and applied them to conventional escort operations, with results that stunned everyone who observed them. His second support group became the most feared anti-submarine unit in the Atlantic. By 1944, Walker had personally directed the destruction of more U-boats than any other British commander in the war. But the relentless operational pace broke him. He collapsed aboard his flagship, HMS Starling, in July 1944, and died of a cerebral thrombosis at 48 years old. The Navy gave him a full naval funeral. They did not mention that half of what made him great had been learned aboard ships that officially did not exist. Henderson survived the war, returned to civilian life in 1946, worked in maritime insurance in Southampton, and never spoke publicly about his service. When he died in 1987, his family found among his papers a distinguished service order citation, so heavily redacted that only his name and the date remained legible. His son spent years in naval archives piecing together the truth. When he finally understood what his father had done in the North Atlantic in 1942, he told a historian that learning it felt like discovering that the quiet man who had read him bedtime stories had once been someone entirely different. But the legacy of the Q-ship program did not die with the men who created it. It evolved, spread, and embedded itself into the strategic thinking of every major naval power on Earth, though rarely with attribution to the men who built the original. The United States Navy studied the British Q-ship program extensively during the Cold War, and the concept of maritime deception operations that emerged from that study drew directly on the Atlantic experience. During the Vietnam War, the U.S. Navy operated a small number of vessels along the Vietnamese coast designated as waterborne guard posts, disguised as civilian junks, but carrying concealed weapons and communications equipment used to intercept North Vietnamese coastal supply operations. The tactical lineage was direct and acknowledged in classified operational reviews, not declassified until the 1990s. The total statistical legacy of the program, compiled from records progressively declassified between 1972 and 2001, confirmed 14 German submarines destroyed across both world wars. Combined 23 others damaged severely enough to abort their patrols and behavioral disruption, costing the German submarine service the equivalent of approximately 200 additional patrol days per month during peak Q-ship operations. 200 patrol days per month spent being cautious instead of aggressive. 200 patrol days that translated into convoys arriving safely and merchant sailors coming home alive. In the modern era, the principle has evolved into something broader and more sophisticated. Naval forces around the world maintain the capability to operate vessels that are not what they appear to be. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard operates armed vessels disguised as civilian fishing craft. The Chinese Navy has been documented using civilian-appearing ships for intelligence operations and territorial assertion. The principle that Campbell understood in 1940, that the most powerful weapon is not always the biggest gun, but sometimes the deepest doubt, has become a permanent and unremarkable feature of maritime strategy. That permanence is his real legacy, and it carries no plaque, no memorial, and no name attached to it anywhere a casual observer would find it. The deeper lesson of the Q-ship story, the one that applies beyond naval warfare and beyond the Second World War, is about the relationship between innovation and the institutions that innovation must survive in order to matter. Campbell's idea was not new in 1940. It was not technologically advanced. It required no scientific breakthrough, no industrial mobilization, no allocation of resources that a major naval power could not have found on a Tuesday afternoon. It required only the willingness to look at a problem from an angle that the established hierarchy considered beneath serious consideration. The Admiralty's objection to Q-ships was never fundamentally that they could not work. The objection was that they were unglamorous, unconventional, and difficult to fit into the existing framework of how a navy was supposed to fight. This pattern has repeated itself in virtually every significant military innovation of the past century. The tank was dismissed by cavalry officers who could not envision a battlefield without horses. Radar was resisted by admirals who trusted their lookouts more than their instruments. Precision-guided munitions were opposed by bomber commanders who had built entire careers around area bombardment. In every case, the innovation succeeded not because the institution embraced it willingly, but because specific individuals refused to stop pushing long after any reasonable person would have accepted defeat. Campbell was retired in his 50s with a bad knee and no active command for 20 years. And he did not hesitate for 1 second when the opportunity came. That refusal to hesitate in the face of institutional skepticism, resource constraints, and the knowledge that failure meant men dying in ships that could not defend themselves. That is the thing that deserves to be remembered, not the guns behind the panels, the decision to build them. And now the detail that almost no one knows. In 2003, when the last tranche of classified Q-ship records was released by the National Archives, researchers discovered a document that had been sealed since 1943. It was a letter from Karl Dönitz to the German Naval High Command, dated February 1943, 1 month before the Admiralty suspended the Q-ship program. In the letter, Dönitz requested authorization to develop Germany's own version of the Q-ship concept. He proposed converting a small number of German merchant vessels into armed decoys capable of sailing among Allied convoys, transmitting false intelligence and attacking escort vessels from within the convoy formation. The proposal was rejected by the Naval High Command as logistically impractical. But the fact that it existed at all reveals something that no operational report could have said as clearly. Jing, the man who had spent 2 years trying to defeat Campbell's deception, had become so impressed by its effectiveness that he wanted to copy it. He had studied the losses, analyzed the behavioral disruption imposed on his commanders, and concluded that the tool was worth having. The highest compliment a military innovation can receive is imitation by the enemy. Campbell never knew about that letter. He had been dead for 10 years before it was declassified. He was still alive when Dönitz wrote it in 1943. Retired reviewing convoy paperwork in an office overlooking the Thames, entirely unaware that the man he had been fighting for 3 years had just written the final answer to every admiral who had told him his idea was a relic. Better. A retired naval officer with a Victoria Cross and a bad knee proposed disguising merchant ships as floating traps, sent volunteers to sea in ships designed to be shot at, and forced the most effective submarine fleet in history to doubt what it saw and waste what it could not replace. The Q-ship program confirmed 14 U-boat kills, disrupted 200 patrol days per month at its peak, and contributed to saving an estimated 12,000 lives through behavioral change alone. The men who made it possible went to their graves without being able to tell their own children what they had done. Their names do not appear on memorials. Their faces do not appear in documentaries. The institution they served buried their contribution as efficiently as a U-boat buries a ship. But those ghosts changed the Atlantic War. And Karl Dönitz, sitting in his headquarters in early 1943, trying to figure out how to copy what they had built, knew it. If you know a story like this one, a story about ordinary people who did something extraordinary that history forgot, leave it in the comments below. Because the Second World War produced hundreds of innovations that were called insane before they were called essential, and the people behind them deserve to be remembered. Subscribe if you want to hear more of those stories. History is full of ghosts, and someone needs to speak their names. The most dangerous weapon in any war is not a torpedo, a bomb, or a gun. It is an idea that the enemy never sees coming.